How's my sound check? We good? Okay. So thank you very much, Girchi and the UBC faculty for inviting me. It would be a pleasure coming here even if I wasn't doing academic administration, but it really is. And so it's a delight to see you, and very nice to see so many friendly faces from our nursing history years across the nation. So thanks for inviting me. My talk today is on transnational nurse migration, which, as most of you know, is a very pressing issue in contemporary nursing and healthcare today. The question of internationally educated practitioners or foreign-trained nurses or migrant nurses has gained the attention, of course, of the, hi Sonia, I can see there, gained the attention of nursing organizations. It has gained the attention of policymakers at a range of government levels who are trying to sort of manage migrant flows. And of course, it's gained the attention of academics who have provided critical perspectives on the subject matter. Now, in most of these studies, the assumption of these analyses are premised on the idea that nurse migration, transnational nurse migration, is really a phenomenon of the 1990s, really accelerated in the 1990s, and most of the discussions start there. And that's a moment when global labor markets were expanding and when national financial crises were undercutting advanced and developing national healthcare systems alike. And so there's no doubt that things happened in the 1990s to pay attention to. But I want to add some historical dimensions to these discussions. I want to demonstrate that transnational nurse migration is not new, but also I think that it's important to understand that as migration intersected with and flowed through other powerful forces shaping the profession. So my talk today presents evidence from the earlier parts of the 20th century. I fear it meanders a bit, and I think when I introduce you to some of the nurse migrants later in the talk, you'll see that perhaps my talk is meandering like their careers did. But at the end, I want to think about how to bring some historical insights into our current engagement with the question of global nurse migration. Now, I do have a PowerPoint, and I will just tell you that, as is often the case when I'm teaching, it's not very good. So don't worry if you it's always hard to know how clear the images are. This is straight off of Google search about Canada nurse migration, a Foreign Worker Canada program for, it's interesting, there's a beautiful typo, CanadianImmigration.net, about working in Canada, to give you some sense of the currency of this topic, and of course the importance of the Canadian nurse, and some recent feminist and critical publications, Salima Valiani's fine work, Rethinking Unequal Exchange. So these are some of the kinds of contemporary discussions. My story, though, I think takes us back slightly to March of 1905. And in an era before PowerPoint, this is how we would do show and tell. When a small group of educated, mostly Toronto women, launched the inaugural issue of Canada's first scholarly journal dedicated to enhancing the status of professional nursing in the nation, titled The Canadian Nurse. The journal would, for the next century or more, address issues central to the working lives of educated, skilled, and professionally credentialed nurses in Canada. So you can come in. This, of course, I rescued from Natalie Rigler's dumpster when she was getting rid of the many versions or collections of the Canadian Nurse that she'd acquired. So in 1905, the fate of this journal was by no means secure. Initially published only 4 times a year, when no national nursing organization yet existed in Canada, where some provinces no provincial associations, and in fact, you all know from your high school history that in 1905, Alberta and Saskatchewan were just becoming provinces. And when women could not vote, nor did they meet the threshold of persons under the BNA Act, right? So the Canadian Nurse was, in many ways, a fragile project. And so rather than seeing this journal as representing kind of a pre-established set of interests of practitioners, I want to argue that the Canadian Nurse is better understood as a project dedicated to creating an imagined community of professionally educated nurses in Canada. Now, some of you may be more familiar than others with this term, imagined community, that comes from Benedict Anderson's provocative 1983 book, which was then republished, Imagined Communities. There's the first pages of the 1905 Canadian Nurse. Come back to that in a minute. Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origins and Spread of Nationalism. Now, this is the point where you all say, oh dear, the historian is going to go off on some lit review that she's been hiding since she finished her dissertation. This is not one of those. This is actually a sort of a kind of a bring together to understand that Anderson argued in this book that since the 19th century, newly formed governments and those that were trying to emerge as nation states. So after the French Revolution, all through the 19th century, when these new nation states were forming, these governments could not and did not assume that a national identity among the people contained in that nation state already existed. A nation state was not, in the words of Anderson, quote, an unproblematic primordial given, unquote. Rather, he argues, emerging national governments had to inculcate among its people a nationalist ideology, a sense of belonging. But to do so, they had to knit together people who had never, and probably would never, meet each other face to face, and who instead had strong cultural and personal ties to local, ethnic, and older forms of dynastic rule. So if we think of France, for example, we think, well, you know, a French person's a French person, but in fact the new French government in the 19th century had to break people's loyalty to the crown and rather inculcate loyalty to the nation. Fragmented by geography and by the powerful pull of parochial identities, citizens of 19th and 20th century nation states came to see each other as part of a national community through particular ideologies and institutions. Most significantly for Anderson, the popular press. In the 19th century, new technologies of the telegraph, which permitted information to be transmitted almost instantaneously, and the printing press, which made cheap mass publications possible, combined to allow newspapers to disseminate reports about disparate regions of the nation, about the central government, and about international affairs instantaneously. And this dissemination occurred in a shared vernacular, a common language of the people. The popular press thus, to some degree, collapsed time and space. A reader in Victoria could read the same story as a reader in Halifax. It ensured that readers throughout the nation developed a shared understanding of the events, personalities, and debates that defined their sense of national belonging. Now, Anderson has an interesting side piece where he argues that other technologies such as museums, maps, and the census, I'll come back to that, the census where populations could be tracked, were also important in cementing this shared vision of who is in this national community, this imagined community of national identity. So Anderson's framework, I think you can see, is useful for thinking how the Canadian nurse created to work an imagined community of professionally educated nurses in the early 20th century. The editorial statement for the inaugural issue declared, "The Canadian Nurse will be devoted to the interests of nursing profession in Canada. It's the hope of its founders that this magazine may aid in uniting and uplifting the profession and in keeping alive that esprit de corps and desire to grow better and wiser in work and life, which should always remain to us a daily ideal." So in this and subsequent issues, readers learned about the activities of colleagues who they would never meet face-to-face, a la Anderson's analysis, but whose activities were nonetheless of relevance. So for in the first issue, readers learned about the Graduate Nurses Association of Ontario's second annual meeting. It read a report about a nurses' registry in Winnipeg that I'll talk about in a minute, and also advice on the economical purchase of medical supplies from the Ross Memorial Hospital in Lindsay, Ontario. Alumni news from institutions across the nation alerted members to hospital renovation and construction projects, to graduation ceremonies from nursing schools, to administrative appointments of their colleagues, and of course the campaigns to win provincial registration legislation. Each issue included a hospital news section, which, if I can get, there's the, like this, which you don't have to read, but we literally learned that, for example, Miss Clara Evans, superintendent of the Kootenay Lake General Hospital in Nelson, BC, will spend August and September visiting the coast cities and seeing the Portland Fair. right? So this sense of reporting on the activities and adventures of this imagined community was a regular feature of the Canadian nurse. And I guess I could argue that this is a kind of a census following Anderson, a census of tracking who's in this imagined community and what are they doing. And so by December of 1905, the publication committee celebrated the great need for such a journal, citing as evidence the 4,000 copies that had been published in the first year. Indeed, that committee noted that the Canadian Nurse had been adopted as the official organ of the Graduate Nurses Associations of Ontario and Montreal and various hospital alumni associations. And the editors called upon practitioners across the nation. It is imperative that it have the loyal support of all the nursing profession of Canada. So producing an imagined community of Canadian nurses relied on breaking down local loyalties, these parochial loyalties to hospital alumni associations or perhaps even urban economies, or if not totally breaking them down, funneling them in to this national body. At the same time, though, the Canadian Nurse is undertaking another project, in that it sought to shore up the boundaries between those practitioners educated in the practices of scientific medicine and those care workers who were providing personal and domestic services rooted in non-scientific training and experience. In other words, the Canadian Nurse and the professionals it sought to unite had to engage in what sociologist of science Thomas Guerin has termed boundary work. And I don't know if any of you who have read any sociology of science have come across this. It's a 1983 article. And Guerin in that article argues that rather than seeing science as a thing or a fixed status, you are science or you're not, he was interested in the process, a historical process, whereby some activities or personnel acquire the status of being scientific through this boundary work of drawing the boundaries of themselves between science and non-science. Now, Guerin uses as an example the 19th century theoretical or pure sciences who sought to elevate their status and also gain greater financial patronage in the English university system. He focused on John Tyndall, the physicist who did research on radiant heat and radiant energy. And between 1853 and 87, Tyndall was professor and then superintendent at the Royal Institution in London. And this position was dedicated to educating the population on the advances of science. And Tyndall used his popular addresses and his public speeches and his writing to serve to distinguish science, by which he meant pure and applied, pure and theoretical science, from the other powerful way of knowing in the 19th century, and that was religion. So religion was not science, it was about faith, about spirituality, about maybe metaphysics, but very different, he argued, than science, which was about commanding the natural world. And he challenged both the Church of England and the Catholic Church in Ireland over who should have authority over knowing the natural world. But interestingly, Tyndall also had to distinguish theoretical science from the applied knowledge of engineers, mechanics, and craftsmen, all those applied scientists who had used their knowledge to ignite Britain's Industrial Revolution, and which in the 19th century were highly admired. So the scientific work of university professors was, then, a superior way of knowing the world than the non-science of religion or the applied science of engineering. And so we can see in the first issues of the Canadian Nurse a comparable process where professionally educated nurses are trying to define themselves squarely in the middle of the biomedical revolution of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So we see articles on specific kinds of work, on emergency nursing, obstetrical work, operating room techniques, along with discussions of complications of particular diseases, scarlet fever and pneumonia. And these were all written in the case file method that, of the medical journal, where, particular patient, this, male or female, this age, these presentations, here's the evidence, very much in presenting the discussion in a scientific mode of presentation. Likewise, short reviews of recently published medical texts kept nurses alerted to possible resources. Contributions from practitioners in the field instructed colleagues how to produce sort of necessary tools using scientific formulas. So for example, here we have a contribution on how to make an antiseptic, a cheap and excellent formula. It takes the place of expensive proprietary articles in every particular. And here, what interests me is, in addition to the recipe for making this antiseptic, this very kind of precise scientific explanation of the thionyl, the methyl, the salicylate, the boric, the eucalyptol. So very much as we might remember from our undergraduate first year chemistry class, of having very clear description. Here is one for bismuth formic iodide. Again, the various volumes of glycerine, alcohol, aqua, and bismuth formic iodide. I'm sorry, I'm butchering those. Okay, so these discussions of the science, the scientific recipes, the scientific knowledge included in the journal. The journal also entered into debates about new and controversial inventions. This is a discussion of scopolamine. Someone from Michigan wrote to say that they have been using scopolamine and morphia with some success, and there's the particular ratios that are needed. 3 hypodermic injections, 1 hour apart, at least the last half hour, an hour before the operation. The final preparation of the patient can be done while under the influence. Much less chloroform is used. Nausea and vomiting is less, but its use is entirely in the experimental stage. It has not been used long enough for the surgeons to form a judgment in the matter. The editor then weighs in with a discussion to say we're glad to have this note. There's a difference of opinion on the subject. Toronto General Hospital, the results have not been favorable. De Morans of Paris condemns the use of it. Wood of Philadelphia is quite favorable to it. So clearly we have this sense that nurses are being pulled into the scientific discussions of the day and the debates over scientific innovations. And of course, nurses were the objects also of advertisers who presented even simple supplies like milk, explaining here, and I'm sorry you can't see this very well, the milk containers are sterilized every day. It's carefully tested before received. So assuring the nurses that when they suggest that their clients have the reindeer condensed milk sweetened Jersey sterilized cream, unsweetened, that they're getting a scientifically tested product. And of course then other kinds of biomedical interventions were advertised in the pages of the Canadian Nurse, including this commercial antiseptic and disinfectant, and then everyone's favorite glycoheroin being used for coughs, bronchitis, pneumonia, laryngitis, etc. Has anybody here seen The Nick, the TV show with Clive Owen about 1900? The very last scene of the first, yeah, okay, all right. I won't tell you, you're going to watch it. I won't tell you. Okay. So the Canadian Nurse located professional nursing firmly within the boundaries of biomedical knowledge and practice. So the third thing we see the Canadian Nurse doing, this boundary work of creating an imagined community of scientifically prepared professional Canadian nurses, is occurring on the same pages that simultaneously sought to strengthen and celebrate the international character of the nursing profession. Authors and editors of the Canadian Nurse understood that fostering a strong national identity would permit Canadian nurses to assume their rightful place in the international sisterhood of nurses. And the fine publication, Nurses of All Nations, dedicated to the anniversary of the International Council of Nurses, includes an essay by Nancy Tomes and Gircha, in which they explain that British suffragist Ethel Gordon Fenwick, who initiated the ICN in 1899, did so out of this bold idea that an international nursing organization would link infant national societies, each struggling to improve its professional status, and that through international collaboration, nurses would strengthen the vocational cause at home as well as promote the highest standards abroad. So this vision of an international space, an international platform where national nursing organizations would come together as equals, was very much on the agenda for the editors of the early Canadian Nurse. Internationalism, of course, had another meaning that we see in the journal. Nursing skills were portable, and practitioners with a wide range of formal and informal training use those skills to help them traverse national boundaries and establish themselves in local economies. Canadian nurses were active participants in this transnational migration, taking their skills to missionary fields. If you've done any reading on missionary nursing, you'll know about the mobility of those nurses, working for colonial authorities, moving to large and exciting American and European cities, and of course, serving the Canadian and British military in faraway war zones. So we know a lot about the movements of Canadian nurses, there's no doubt. And this movement was reported in the Canadian Nurse. For example, the inaugural issue reported that Miss Lena Rogers, who became an important nurse leader, who's a graduate of Sick Children's Hospital Toronto, has been appointed superintendent of the public school nurses of New York City. In 1906, the journal reported that Miss Henrietta McKim of Jalfa Hospital, Persia, is at home on Toronto on furlough. So in fact, the journal sounded downright cavalier about the international movement of Canadian nurses. And of course, we also know that Canada was the favorite destination for many migrant nurses in the early years of the 20th century. English and American educated nurses featured prominently in the histories of early Canadian hospitals and were frequently profiled in the Canadian Nurse. But of course, migrant nurses brought with them their own complications in terms of integrating them into this imagined communities. Were they scientifically prepared? How did they complicate the boundary work of distinguishing professional from non-professional nurses? So these three sort of themes, the imagined community of Canadian nurses, the boundary work of scientifically prepared professional nurses in the context of celebrating internationalism. These are the three issues put on the agenda in the 1905 Canadian Nurse. And I want to look and see how those three themes worked on the ground in practice. So to do that, I want to shift the discussion away from this ideological work to the on-the-ground work undertaken in local health economies. And my example I'm going to use is a nurses' registry from 1911 Winnipeg that I found. The registry had been formed in 1905. The registry documents that I have found started in 1911. It was housed in the medical library at 220 McDermott, so clearly it was understood as an important resource for the biomedical community in the city. And nurses who were available for work completed registry cards with the following information: their name, address, phone number, their qualifications and their years of experience, the kinds of nursing they were willing to undertake, their fee, and then physician references. Now, the collection from 1911 to 1917 is most complete. So here's an example of one of the cards. This is Katherine Kelly, who lived in Suite J of the Ashford block. She'd been nursing for 3 years, and her qualifications were that she was a graduate of St. Boniface Hospital. Most of you know St. Boniface Hospital is one of the sort of three big hospitals in the city and in the Winnipeg area: St. Boniface, the Winnipeg General, and Misericordia. So she's a graduate. She's willing to do general nursing. Which branch are you keen on doing? Will you take cases outside of Winnipeg? Yes, any place. She lists her fee for non-infectious and for infectious cases, and lists her physicians. And November 10th, 1911, she registered. The interesting thing about this is although from our vantage point she seems like a regular graduate nurse, in 1911 she was actually a minority. For one thing, she seemed to be from the Winnipeg area. Of the 68 nurses who registered between 1911 and 1917, and whose registry cards I have access to, who survived, 18 had moved from Winnipeg from overseas, from Ireland, Scotland, England, France, and Germany. A further 10 cited American training and or work history. Another 8 had moved from Eastern Canada, and another 8 had education or experience elsewhere. Sorry, my chart disappeared on my PowerPoint. Okay, and 8. So in other words, of the 68 registration cards, less than 35 of them would be considered local. 65% had moved into the Winnipeg community. And of that, I think 25% were from overseas. Now these numbers are contextualized carefully. I mean, Winnipeg itself was a fast-growing city before World War I, so it's not surprising we have a very mobile and migrant nurse community. And It also may be that Winnipeg raised and educated nurses didn't need the registry as much. They had local connections. They didn't have, they had doctors or other nurses that gave them the connections to secure work. So it's as important to see the presence on this registry of migrant nurses, though it may overstate the mobility and migrant status of the workforce. What it also shows, though, is that it's difficult to figure out which of these migrant nurses belong to this imagined community of professional nurses that the Canadian nurse was trying to build. So some migrant nurses claim solid education from established and accredited schools across the globe. So here, for example, we have Ella Sharkey. In 1912, she entered in the registry. She's a year in the Boston City Hospital, and she was registered at the Boston Medical Library. Alice Carpenter had her qualifications from the Rockford Hospital in the province of Ontario. It was a hospital for mental diseases. So the registry attracted many graduates who had formal training of some nature, although it was very hard to figure out what their training really was. Others had training in related fields. For example, here we have Margaret Connolly, who trained, she had 7 years experience, and she trained at the National Maternity Hospital in Dublin, Ireland. Here we have Janet Christat, who had 4 months at the Glasgow Maternity and Women's Hospital. And in fact, many of the transnational migrants from Ireland, England, Scotland, France, or Germany came with midwifery qualifications. They were registered with the Central Midwifery Board in London, for example. So midwives are actually have a strong presence in this record. Many of the midwives claim no particular training. Here we have Ina Irvine, 5 years midwifery, does obstetrical. So these give you some sense of the diverse training of the members of the registry. Many of them would have fallen short of the status of graduate nurse that was becoming increasingly significant. So we have a nursing workforce that is mobile, but also has a wide range of professional or non-professional education, or probably in the case of Ina Irving, a great deal of just direct obstetrical midwifery local experience. So this evidence illustrates the complexities facing nursing leaders who sought to build an imagined community of professionally educated nurses with strong claims to scientific status in the face of this mobility among nurses, which was profound. So it's not surprising then that in this context, over the next 20 years, nursing leaders across North America and in Great Britain and to some degree in Europe pressed to improve and increase the education provided to and expected of the professional nurse. So we moved from the term the trained nurse to the graduate nurse, to the registered nurse by the 1930s, as the terminology that reflected a new consensus that a professional nurse should be at least 18 years old when they came out of high school, had graduated from high school, had completed a 3-year hospital-based education program that offered a full range of medical subspecialties, and as the decades progressed, appropriate classroom and laboratory space. And those of you who know anything about the history of the UBC university-based nursing education program, this was also a goal put on the agenda in the 1920s and 30s as something that professional nursing should aspire to. The story for the quest for professional education and licensing and the occupational boundaries thus produced is pretty well known. Recent scholarship, though, has shown that this boundary work was not reserved for the North American or perhaps the Anglo-American British nursing context. North American leaders, along with their British counterparts, worked in the 20s and 30s to take this definition of the formally trained registry nurse to other national contexts in Europe, in Latin America. Jamie Leper's outstanding research on the European nursing education in the interwar years shows the way that North American nursing leaders partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation bureaucrats to try to establish the North American model of nursing education in newly formed nations like Hungary after World War I, as well as nations like France that had really resisted the Anglo-American model. So in these programs, international nursing leaders made the boundary work of defining science from non-science a transnational project. And yet, like many such projects, this boundary work took interesting turns. So I want to shift my example again further into the 20th century to the post-World War II decades, when a new stream of European nurses sought to make their homes elsewhere in the world. Now, as you know, a war in Europe between 1939 and 1945 proved devastating for many communities in what is now Germany, the Balkans, so Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, Poland, and the rest of Eastern and Southern Europe. Not only did people lose families and neighbors to war, but the destruction of property meant that people lost their homes, their possessions. Schools, hospitals, and churches were bombed or burned. Reconstruction often involved profound political change, leaving those on the wrong side of that change vulnerable to persecution. Such was the context that impelled thousands of Europeans to leave their countries of origin between 1945 and 1965 to seek prosperity and stability elsewhere in the world. And among those migrants were nurses who immediately after migration or after getting settled decided they wanted to reclaim their status as professionally prepared nurses, but didn't have the evidence to prove it. Now, we know about these nurses from a strange archival route. And the short version is, while Girchi and her colleagues were preparing the history of the ICN that I mentioned before, they found a series of boxes that contained extensive case files. The case files were arranged by nation of origin, and they tracked the correspondence from migrant nurses who were trying to rebuild their professional credentials. So there would be a box on Austria, for example, alphabetized with all these neatly alphabetized cases. So every time an Austrian nurse was trying to find her credentials, a case file was created, and it was created in the ICN. The files have a common narrative in that we have a migrant nurse working in a hospital in Canada or the United States, Australia, New Zealand, sometimes France, often Britain, Israel. They're working there. And they're often working in a hospital or in some kind of healthcare role. They realize, or a supervisor realizes, that they have more skills than what their current status suggests. I imagine a conversation, something like, gee, you seem to be very good at this particular activity, and the ward aide or the nursing assistant says, well, I was a nurse in my home country. This conversation then leads to them being encouraged to get in touch with the provincial registrar in the Canadian context, in the United States, obviously state registrars, to try to get registered as a nurse. And this is in a context, too, when the Canadian healthcare system is looking for nurses. There's a nursing shortage. Of course, many of these women didn't have proper credentials, and so the provincial registrar would suggest that the employee try to find some. And the place that they suggested most often was the International Council of Nurses in Geneva at the time. Now, the ICN was not set up for this work at all. That wasn't supposed to be its role. But one staff member, a Latvian-born nurse named Alice Schur, took on the task of trying to track down proof of educational equivalency. And sometimes she found out that they were equivalent, and sometimes she found that they were lacking something and needed to upgrade, and sometimes she concluded that they were midwives or felshers or some non-nurse role and weren't equivalent at all. So let me give you the example of LL, an Estonian nurse, and let me tell you her life story we learned from her case file to give you a sense of this process. LL was born in 1918 in Russia, in an area that after World War I became the Republic of Estonia. At age 20, in 1938, she entered the Medical School of Tartu nursing program. She graduated in May 1941. This is important. The three-year program is important, of course. But by 1944 was forced to flee to Germany, where she was sent to work in various hospitals, and it's not very clear what that sent to work process was. But when the American forces liberated West Germany, she then got a position with UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Association. I always get them. And then she moved to London in 1947. Initially, she worked as a domestic, but then she applied for and got permission to work in a maternity hospital. Then she took on a staff position at another hospital. Then she went to London, where she worked in private nursing before immigrating to Canada in 1950. She had lost her documents, of course, not surprising since she'd fled her home in the middle of war. And so when she applied for registration in the province of Ontario, she was asked to provide proof. She sent the few documents she did have to SHUR at the ICN, and she cited the name of her nursing superintendent in Tartu. Now, fortunately, that particular superintendent had left her registry of her nursing school with SHUR before the superintendent herself went to Paraguay. So this registry empowered SHUR to write to LL in February 1951 that this letter will be regarded as conclusive proof of your professional status by the Nurse Registration Branch in Toronto. And Miss Weir, the provincial registrar, happily took her word. LL promptly replied to SHUR from her home on Queen Street in Toronto with great thanks, quote, "I really cannot put my thoughts into words, but I would love to say my sincerest thanks. I will do my best to be successful in my profession." So there is one situation where, and what intrigues me about this research is the degree to which this transnational mobilization of resources was kicked into gear. We have the local superintendent, we have the registrar in the province, we have the ICN office. Sure, we have the Tartu nursing connection where the registry happened to wind up at the ICN, but SHUR also wrote to the International Refugee Organization and the International Labour Organization to also try to, and UNRWA, to try to actually generate these documents. So she worked very hard, as did the local registrars, to try to serve these individuals well. I mean, local registrars and employers could have simply encouraged LL to continue working in a non-professional capacity. They didn't, have to go to these lengths, but they didn't. They could have simply said they didn't have the resources. They didn't. Rather, they reached out in all sorts of professional agencies, contacts, and connections to discern the validity of an applicant's claims. Now, not all of these files have such happy endings in them. The story of VS is illustrative. VS wrote SHUR in 1962 with a similar request. She wanted to confirm she was a graduate nurse. She explained that she was employed at Toronto's Baycrest Hospital. She wanted to write her registration exams so she could register in Ontario. She had been born in Prague, where she trained at a Jewish hospital at age 16 because Jews in Prague weren't allowed to finish high school. She had been, in her words, excluded from all governmental schools and training according to the German Nuremberg laws of racial discrimination. Shortly after she finished her nursing training, she had her diploma and pin taken away from her, and she was deported to a concentration camp. There she worked in the Hospital of the Jewish Self-Administration. When the hospital was liberated in 1945, she then finished high school and began to study medicine. So she has her high school, she has her nursing, she has some medical training. But the ascent of the communists in 1948 in Prague convinced VS that it was not the place she wanted to live, so she moved to Israel, where she worked for 12 more years before migrating to Canada in 1961. Now, SHUR responded that she couldn't confirm VS's education, that the Jewish hospital program, as far as she knew, was only 1 year in duration, not 3. It was aimed at practical nurses, not professional nurses, and, as VS herself had said, she took that training before she'd finished high school. So SHUR said, no, we can't give you equivalencies. Now, given everything VS had gone through, it's not maybe surprising that her tone was sharp in her response to SHUR. VS wrote, "I can hardly be blamed that the German authorities excluded us from the governmental schools on the basis of their racial laws, for which I personally paid the highest price anyway." Her personal and political analysis was born of a lifetime of managing diverse forms of political and state authorities. She navigated a racist colonizing power in her home country of Czechoslovakia, a local administration in a Nazi concentration camp, a fledgling communist regime, a fledgling new nation state in Israel, Canada's post-war immigration policy, Ontario nurses registration legislation, and now the international nursing authorities. So there's no doubt then, as I said at the beginning, that nurses had to traverse political, national, ideological, and professional boundaries in challenging and difficult ways. So my conclusion, I guess, is maybe not that profound or surprising, that transnational migration is not new, and it tested the strength of nursing leaders' efforts in the past to create an imagined community of professional nurses in Canada and elsewhere. So significant recent scholarship has interrogated the promises and pitfalls of transnational migration for nurses since the 1990s. Research by Karen Flynn on Black Canadian nurses, or Catherine Choi on Filipino-American nursing, or Diva Stasioulis's work on Canadian federal policy. They've all pointed to the ways that race, colonialism, and global inequality have complicated the transnational nurse experience. From those studies, we learned that many migrant nurses have chafed over having to spend time and money to upgrade their credentials, especially when they feel their own training is being undercredited. Other nurses have chafed at being funneled into ancillary occupational categories because they couldn't get their credentials recognized. Some have expressed frustration that in the North American context, bedside direct patient care is downplayed in the face of charting medications and supervising other staff. Nursing leaders and feminist critics have worried that transnational migration serves to drain skilled workers from nations whose economies and healthcare systems are already under stress. Reports of unethical recruiting highlights the vulnerability of migrant nurses. And Canadian scholars have argued that federal policymakers have turned too quickly to migrant nurses rather than attending to educational and employment restrictions that are diminishing nursing as an occupational choice for many native-born students. Now, nursing's international leadership has not been silent in the face of these concerns. In 2005, the ICN released a position statement on ethical nurse recruitment. It recognizes the right of individual nurses to migrate and confirms the potential beneficial outcomes of multicultural practice and learning opportunities by migration, but also acknowledges the adverse effects that international migration may have on the health quality in countries seriously depleted of their nursing workforce. And from these concerns, the ICN has identified elements of what it considers to be ethical nurse recruitment, effective human resource planning leading to national self-sustainability, credible nurse regulation, freedom of movement, and freedom of association, all things that I think the Canadian nurse editors in 1905 would have strongly supported. So as a historian, I read this 2005 document as a reflection of current need and to some degree as a reflection of past preoccupations. Professional nursing has a deep historic commitment to facilitating nurse migration and an equally deep commitment to the boundary work of defining which nurses meet the threshold of being scientific and which undertake work that is cast as non-science. In Canada, nurse leaders and organizations have sought to foster its imagined community by helping nurses traverse national borders while also working to strengthen the boundaries of scientific nursing through strong credentialing. This has led to both inclusion and exclusion for individual migrants. And I think the challenge for Canadian nursing today, as for nursing across the globe, is to think critically about these boundaries and borders and think about new and creative ways that the profession can reach out across those borders to make sure not just that graduate or professional or registered nurses are well cared for, but in fact that migrants in many areas of healthcare today are equally protected. That's it.